I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I welcome you to a presentation on 1774, the year the revolution began. We also welcome our fellow veterans who are viewing this program from the Edith Norse Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Robert Bob Allison, an expert on the American Revolution. Bob Allison is chair of Revolution 250, a consortium of 70 organizations across Massachusetts working together to prepare for the 250th anniversary of the events that led to the American Revolution. That'll be in 2026. He has been a member of the history faculty at Suffolk University for the past 25 years, including 10 years as chair. He's written books on the American Revolution, and he has co-edited a book about the ratification of the Constitution. Now, here in Lexington, we're all geared up for Lex 250, which is the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington. But Bob is not just concerned with one little town. He's overseeing 70 organizations in the whole state. So talk about herding cats. So he's got a very big job ahead of him, but they picked the right man for the job. So please welcome Bob Allison.
Well, thank you, Linda. Thank you, Miyum. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to the veterans here. It actually is one of, and even more now, having heard from, I'll call you Brian and Fresh. One of my regrets is never having served. And I think that rubbed off on my two sons. One is an active duty member of the Coast Guard. The other, who actually his full-time job is working for Veteran Services in the city of Boston, is now a Coast Guard reservist. So thank you. And thank you for answering the call when you did. And as Linda very kindly said, I'm involved with Revolution 250, a consortium of about 75 groups throughout the Commonwealth, looking at ways we can commemorate the beginnings of American independence. And I know here in Lexington, it is an article of faith that it began here. John Adams, and I think he has as much right as anyone to have an opinion, said that the American Revolution was accomplished before a drop of blood was spilled at Lexington Green. That gets a better reaction in most other places. Adams, of course, did not serve in the military, and he was thinking about the political actions that brought both the British soldiers going out to seize the weapon stockpile they conquered, as well as the Lexington militia to the Green on the 19th of April of 1775. And he said that after the shot was fired on Lexington Green, the war for independence began. But for Adams, the revolution had already happened. It was a revolution in the minds of the people of Massachusetts about how they would be governed, whether they would be governed by a distant king and parliament, or whether they would continue to govern themselves in their town meetings as they had. And this is really the event we see happening in 1774. In fact, at the beginning of the year, 1774, Thomas Gage, who in the middle of the year would become the governor of Massachusetts, he was then in London, said that people in England talk more seriously than ever about America. That crisis is come, Gage said, when the provinces must either be British colonies or independent and separate states. What will be done? Nobody, I believe, can yet tell. And that's one thing to remember as we're thinking about these events of 1774, 75, and 76. No one knew the outcome. The same year, John Lathrop, who was the pastor of the Second Church in Boston, speculated about how 50 years later, that is in 2025, people would look back on their era? Would their local differences and jealousies, as you all know, there's a neighboring town that also claims it is where everything began. Would their local differences and jealousies make united efforts impossible? Or would the colonists hold a Congress and embark on a quiet and peaceful suspension of trade? Or would they do something else? And Lathrop said that life and death, in a political sense, are now set before us. And the fate of America for many generations depends on the virtue of her sons and daughters, and not on this present day. So Gage and Lathrop both recognize this big choice that is looming over both Americans and Britons in 1774. And we really see it most clearly here in Massachusetts. This, by the way, is the cover of the almanac for the year 1774. So printed at the end of 1773. It's a Paul Revere drawing of Governor Thomas Hutchinson. He looks much different in his portrait. And the caption is, "The wicked statesman in the hour of his death." So it's not just, we don't really like Hutchinson anymore. He is the wicked statesman about to be speared by death as the devil stands over him holding his crimes. And this is quite a change for Hutchinson and for Massachusetts in 1774. And much as, of course, we know the big event of 1773 was the destruction of the tea. And last year, tremendous reenactments of the destruction of the tea. 20,000 people turned out for this event last year. And great thing to commemorate, as is the first shot on Lexington Green, which you do a great job of doing every year on Patriots' Day. The big event in early 1774 was something much more difficult to recreate in a public commemoration. I don't doubt you're going to get crowds to turn out for a reenactment of the crisis over who is going to pay the judges in Massachusetts. But this actually is the big political issue in early 1774. The British ministry recognized, after the unfortunate events of 1770, the bloody massacre, as we call it, they had dodged a very real crisis, because the soldiers, who were all charged with murder and would have suffered death had they been convicted, and two of them were convicted of manslaughter, which was still a hanging offense in 1770. What would have happened had they been convicted? Fortunately, we know Josiah Quincy and John Adams stepped forward to defend them, arguing that in a free country, counsel is the last thing someone on trial for his life should want, and the soldiers were acquitted, except for the two who were found guilty of manslaughter, and Adams pled benefit of clergy, so they were branded on their thumbs and sent to New Jersey, which is probably a bigger punishment than anyone deserved. What happens the next time? And there's no John Adams or Josiah Quincy stepping forward to defend a British official who gets in trouble with one of these local mobs for doing his duty. So Parliament decided, henceforward, we will pay the judges in Massachusetts and in the other British colonies £200 a year. And this will be a way of making sure their fealty is not to the local mob, but to the law as represented by Parliament. And this appeal to let's us pay the judges and not have these local yokels do this sets off a crisis here in Massachusetts, because according to the Massachusetts Charter, the judges are paid by the Massachusetts Assembly. And if they are being paid by someone else, well, it's exactly what Parliament said. Their loyalty, their fealty is not to the people they serve, but to someone else. So the Massachusetts Assembly immediately says, judges cannot accept a salary from anyone other than us. And one by one, every judge in Massachusetts agreed he would not accept a salary from anyone else. And these are some of the judges who agreed. Edmund Trowbridge was the first one. William Cushing doesn't offer an opinion on this, but he declines the salary. Nathaniel Ropes, is anyone here a judge, by the way? No one wants to admit to being a judge now. Nathaniel Ropes declined the salary after a mob surrounded his house. He was inside suffering from smallpox, and the next day he died. Some people said it was from the stress of having been under attack by a mob. And one of the judges who also refuses the salary is Foster Hutchinson, who is Governor Thomas Hutchinson's brother. And Foster Hutchinson, in 1765, Governor Hutchinson had his house ransacked by a mob and torn apart by a mob. So he knew what it was like to suffer the slings and arrows of an outraged populace, but he also knew what it was like to stand up for what you believed and, more importantly, stand up for your duty. But his brother was not cut from the same cloth, and Foster Hutchinson wrote to his brother, the governor, that he was forced to comply with the demand that he refused the salary because he had a wife, he had children, he had property, and all, he said, were at the mercy of the populace, from whom, Foster said, there was nothing which he had not to fear. You know, it takes us a while to go through the double negatives in that sentence. But anyway, the judges all give in, except for one. And the one who does not give in is Peter Oliver, who is the Chief Justice of the Superior Court, also the brother-in-law of Thomas Hutchinson. So what do you do now? You have every judge going along with the assembly, except for one, the most important one. And John Adams, who is then a member of the assembly, says what we can do is impeach him. And the other members of the assembly said, well, that's really not going to work. A, we've never impeached anyone before, and no colonial assembly had ever impeached a crown official. And I know there was a happy time when I would have to explain to an audience what impeachment was. Unfortunately, we've been berated with examples in the last decade or so. So I'll spare you. If the House impeaches a judge, it would be the governor's council then, the upper house, that would try the accused, and the governor's council is presided over by the governor, who is Peter Oliver's brother-in-law. Also sitting on the council was Judge Oliver's brother, who's the secretary of the province, Andrew Oliver. So what's going to happen when it gets to the upper house? The governor is going to say the assembly can't impeach a crown official. That's the end of the story. Adams says we still have to do it, and they do. It gets to the governor's council, and nothing happens. We'll get back to this later. But as we're talking about this, on the 3rd of March, old Andrew Oliver, the brother of the judge, dies. He's lieutenant. Has been the lieutenant governor, also the secretary of the province. He dies. The year before, when Andrew Oliver's wife died, it was a period of public mourning. In fact, Phyllis Wheatley wrote a poem about Andrew Oliver's wife, his bereavement, really a sad day. Now, he dies on March the 3rd of this year, when his brother is under attack for accepting the salary, and he is told he cannot attend his brother's funeral. His safety could not be guaranteed if he appeared in public in Boston. So we have a change happening here in Boston, here in Massachusetts in 1774, with Crown officials being under attack, not simply by a vengeful mob, but by an assembly, by the order of things here. So this is all what's happening here in Massachusetts. Now, meanwhile, in the spring of 1774, word had reached London about the destruction of the tea. And Parliament responds to the destruction of the tea, not saying, oh boy, this would be a great thing to reenact. We love standing up for civil liberties and so on. Actually, this is Phyllis Wheatley's poem about Oliver's bereavement in 1773. Okay, so Parliament responds by shutting down the Port of Boston, the Boston Port Bill, as a way of punishing Boston for having the tea destroyed in the harbor. Boston Harbor would be shut down, and no trade could go in or out until Boston reimbursed the East India Company for the tea that had been destroyed in December of 1773. And this is going to kill the commerce in Boston. They're going to actually make Salem the primary port in Massachusetts, and perhaps Parliament thought that'll help Salem. Salem then will think, boy, we finally have the advantage over Boston. But that's really not what happens. We don't need to talk about what Salem does, what happens in response to the closing of the port, other than to say Josiah Quincy, who I've already mentioned, writes a pamphlet about the port bill, not saying this is really bad because it's going to hurt Boston's commerce, saying it is an unconstitutional infringement on the liberties of the entire empire. He says a number of things in this. It punishes the innocent along with the guilty. Quincy is a very good lawyer. Also, he points out the East India Company had never asked for any compensation. But now Parliament is stepping in, demanding that the citizens of one part of the empire compensate a private corporation for some injuries Parliament has decided they suffered. Also, he points out, it is illegal for a town, in this case Boston, to appropriate money except for necessary town expenses. But now Parliament is saying Boston has to appropriate money to pay off the East India Company, and why would that be a necessary expense? He also points out that in order to enforce the closure of the port, Parliament is going to have to send a permanent military force to keep order in Boston. This is the threat of a standing army, a permanent military force, which would not be subject to the control of the civilian power. Very powerful statement that Quincy makes in his pamphlet about the port bill. I'm not saying, boy, we poor folks in Boston are going to suffer, but pointing to this as an infringement on the fundamental idea of liberty, which is intrinsic to the empire, as well as to our ideas of what a citizen anywhere is entitled to. One thing we see happening in this period is a shift from thinking about infringements on our rights under a charter or under the Magna Carta to thinking about the fundamental rights we enjoy simply because we live. And in fact, the Quincy's strictures on the Port Act get a response from others. This is a British engraving showing, you see the official with a port bill in his pocket, pouring tea down the throat of Boston. It's called Boston Drinking the Bitter Draught. And you can see other things happening in this engraving, showing you Boston's cannonaded, various sinister British officials, they've been looking up Liberty's skirt. In Virginia, the Virginia Assembly meets, and Virginia's Assembly, the House of Burgesses, calls for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer on June 1st. June 1st is the date the port bill will take effect, and Boston will be surrounded, will be closed down. And Virginia responds not by saying, finally, someone is teaching those people in Massachusetts what's what, but saying, if this happens in Boston, it can happen here. And as the Assembly is calling for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, the governor of Virginia says the Virginia Assembly cannot call for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer in support of the Bostonians. He suspends the Virginia Assembly. They go across the street to a tavern to continue their meeting, and they call for county conventions. And at the county convention in Fairfax County, chaired by George Washington, they draft a series of resolves, the Fairfax Resolves, mainly drafted by George Mason, calling for Virginia to support the people of Massachusetts in their resistance to the closure of the port. And here in Boston, General Gage arrives and in June convenes the Assembly in Salem, and the Assembly calls for a meeting of delegates from all of the colonies in a continental congress to discuss how the other colonies can side with Massachusetts in resisting the acts of the British Crown. As they are doing this, they're electing these 5 worthy gentlemen to be their delegates to the Congress. The new secretary of the province, a guy named Thomas Flucker, comes to tell them the governor has suspended the assembly. Knowing that the governor was going to suspend them, the members of the assembly locked the door. So poor Mr. Flucker has to nail the proclamation that they are suspended to the door as they're electing these guys to be their representatives to a continental Congress. And General Gage arrives in June, hoping to keep Massachusetts loyal, but also required by his orders to rein in this government here. And he has with him, or actually in August, he receives the Massachusetts Government Act. I love the title of it, an act for the better regulating the government of the province of Massachusetts Bay. The Massachusetts Government Act essentially suspends the 1691 charter. And instead of having a governor appointed by the crown with an assembly chosen by the towns, you will have a governor appointed by the crown, and the governor will choose a council to advise the governor. Under the 1691 charter, the assembly could choose a council to advise the governor. The governor simply could veto people he didn't like on the council, but otherwise it was the assembly's choice. Now it's the governor's choice. He will choose 36 worthy individuals from throughout the province to advise him. Also, under the old dispensation, anytime a town wanted to have a meeting, and in fact, anytime any 10 tax-paying men in a town wanted to have a meeting, they would have a town meeting. And whatever that town meeting decided was the law in the town. Back in the 1740s, one of the governors warned that 10 men, even 10 of the meanest sort, and by meanest he meant poorest, not nastiest, can call for a meeting, and whatever those guys decide is the law. And that governor had said, if something isn't done to rein in the democratical nature of their constitution, we're going to have big trouble. Of course, Parliament had other issues on its mind between the 1740s and the 1770s, so nothing was done to rein in this democratical nature of the Constitution until 1774, when the Massachusetts Government Act says you can only have one town meeting a year. You have to have the governor's permission to have it, and you have to tell the governor what you're going to discuss. Also, the town meetings chose every local official, the tree warden, the hog reeves, the inspectors, the sheriffs, the tax collectors. Everyone was chosen by the town meeting. Now, all of those officials are chosen by the governor. So the Massachusetts Government Act takes the power over your local affairs out of your hands and puts them in the hand of the governor with the assistance of any local officials he can find to serve in these positions now that their neighbors are really mad at them for taking up this particular chore. I should point out that the neighboring town, which also claims to be the birthplace of independence, really wasn't on board with any of this resistance until they find out through the Massachusetts Government Act, they no longer can have town meetings unless someone, the governor, approves. So you have this change happening with the Massachusetts Government Act. And for General Gage, the first thing he has to do is find men willing to serve as mandamus counselors. He gets to appoint 36 of them. But one by one, these people he appoints either refuse or they find out their neighbors will be so unhappy if they accept that their choices are either accept and move to Boston or resign and probably still have to move to Boston because your neighbors are upset that he thought you might be willing to serve. So Gage has a problem here. In fact, out in Worcester, he appoints a really distinguished citizen, Timothy Payne. And Mr. Timothy Payne, let me see, this is Timothy Payne. This is his house. Timothy Payne, one of the best respected members of the community in Worcester. He had been an officer in the militia. He had presided at the town meeting. He had been the representative to the general court. He's been appointed to the council. And his house is visited by Timothy Bigelow, who is a colonel in the militia. So he's someone Payne would have known. And Bigelow comes with about 4,000 members of the Worcester County militia. And Bigelow goes in to talk to Mr. Payne and tells him, you'd better resign. And Payne says, yes, I do resign. So Bigelow goes out to say, okay, Payne has resigned. These men standing out in the street say, we need to hear him do it. So Bigelow goes back inside. Payne writes out a letter of resignation, and Bigelow comes out and says, here, I have his letter of resignation. We need to hear him read it. So Mr. Bigelow goes out to read his letter of resignation. Again, I used to say he was an elderly man till I realized I'm probably older than he was. And he didn't have the projection system such as we have here. He didn't have technicians like this making sure everyone can hear. And people said, we can't hear him. So he had to stand in the middle of the road reading his resignation while these 4,000 men walked past him until everyone was satisfied they had actually heard him resign his commission. So this is an extraordinary thing. The Worcester County militia taking upon themselves to force the resignation of Timothy Payne, whose only real crime was agreeing to serve as a member of the governor's council. I think the final indignity, Payne winds up leaving. His house still stands in Worcester. It's actually now the Colonel Timothy Bigelow chapter of the DAR's headquarters in Worcester. So not only is his house now memorialized by the Daughters of the American Revolution, but it's named for the guy who forces him to resign. And so this is what's happening in other places. In the next town, Colonel John Murray also agrees to resign as a mandamus counselor. And down in Taunton, Daniel Leonard, whom you may know, back in the late 1760s, he and John Adams had gotten into a pamphlet dispute. Leonard wrote under the name of Massachusettsensis, and Adams wrote as Novanglis. And Leonard has to flee from Taunton to go into Boston as his house was attacked by a mob. So this is all what's happening in the summer of 1774 as General Gage is trying to establish order, and he finds the men he has chosen to assist him in this cannot accept that particular responsibility. In late August, the committees of correspondence, back in between about 1771 and 1772, the towns of Massachusetts had created committees of correspondence. So it's a committee of the town meeting, chosen to correspond with the other towns, as well as to the committee of correspondence sitting on behalf of the town of Boston. And in late August, all of these committees gather at Faneuil Hall. And they call for a number of things. One thing they call for is because we haven't really resolved satisfactorily who controls the courts. Are they controlled by the governor and the ministry, or are they controlled by the Assembly of Massachusetts? So in order to resolve this, we'll close the courts. We'll also call for county conventions. General Gage had said you can't have town meetings. So the committee correspondence says, well, why don't we have county conventions? As we know in Massachusetts, we do have counties, but we're never really sure what they do, but they do it other than exist. But now they do exist. And the counties will have conventions to figure out what we can do about General Gage. Worcester really is the one calling for county conventions because they want to make sure, they fear that General Gage, knowing what a hotbed of sedition Worcester is going to send troops out there. I just told you what's happening in Worcester. They're forcing for Mr. Payne to resign, doing other things. And there's a fear that, is anywhere from Worcester? I see people laugh. Worcester. Even the turnpike avoids it, as President Boulder would say. So at the same time this is happening, Gage does call for the assembly to meet in Salem in early October. And also, Gage realizes that these towns and counties are stockpiling ammunition. And he thinks it would be a prudent move, as it certainly was, to get the ammunition and weapons out of their hands. And here on the banks of, near the banks of the Mystic River, there's a powder house. This is in Middlesex County. And he knows there are stockpiles of powder there. So on September 1st, Gage sends an expedition up the Mystic River to get the powder out of the powder house and put it in securely at Castle Island in Boston Harbor. So this is what happens on September 1st. And they accomplish their mission. They are rowed up there. The soldiers march to the powder house. They get the powder, cart it down to the water, put it onto the boats, get it to Castle Island. And it seems to have been a successful mission until the next day when actually first, Gage had wanted William Brattle, who was the commander of the Middlesex County Militia, to simply go to this powder house and get it. I should have given you this background first. Brattle, you get elected to be colonel of the militia units in these days. So General Brattle is one of the leading figures in Massachusetts, and Gage tells him to go get the powder, and Brattle says that really wouldn't be a good idea. And Gage, as the governor, can't order Brattle to do this. And when the sheriff comes to ask Brattle if he will get the powder, Brattle says no, but Brattle does give him the keys to the powder house. So Gage is able to get the powder thanks to Brattle. And the next day, Brattle finds his house surrounded by people who are angry with the fact that he gave up the keys to the sheriff to get their powder and take it off to Castle Island. And meanwhile, other citizens, actually, it's the Middlesex County Militia that musters on Cambridge Common, first demanding that Brattle resign as their commanding officer, and second, demanding that other Crown officials also resign. Thomas Oliver, who is absolutely no relation to the other Olivers, had accepted the job as lieutenant governor. He didn't realize he was a candidate for the office. And someone in London sees his name on a list, says he must be related to the other Olivers. And if suddenly you were told you're appointed lieutenant governor, what would your response be?
I accept.
You'd accept, yeah. I mean, here's a public spirited citizen. Maybe I can do some good. And this is what Oliver does. He was quite surprised to be appointed lieutenant governor. And he hears that there's this 3,000, 5,000 men gathered on Cambridge Common. He worries they might decide to do something foolish, like, why don't we march into Boston and get the gunpowder back? And he knows that would be a disaster. So he goes out to talk to the mob. And he says to them, really, marching into Boston would be a disaster. And they say, well, we have to stay here because Gage might send troops out against us. So Oliver, again, says, well, maybe I can do something. He rides into Boston to talk to General Gage, gets Gage to promise, I am not going to send troops out to Cambridge. And so he comes back thinking, okay, everyone's happy. We're not going to be sending forces out to Cambridge. We've averted a war, which is what we're trying to do. But while Oliver is gone, a couple of other individuals come through Cambridge, and one of them, actually, while the mob is waiting, they do something else. There are some judges living in Cambridge. There is James Danforth, who's a judge, and he is older than I am, but I still won't call him elderly. He had been in service for a long time, lives near Harvard Square, and a mob surrounds his house and asks if he wants to resign his position as a judge. And what would you say? Sure. Yes, he does resign. And then this is a guy named Ruggles, Timothy Ruggles. He had been Speaker of the Massachusetts Assembly. He lived in Roxbury. He had been up in Salem meeting with the governor. Now he's heading through Cambridge on his way back to Roxbury. And suddenly we see, here is Ruggles coming through. He's been meeting with the governor. And I don't know if we should call them the mob or the Cambridge militia or the angry citizens who have gathered. They stop him and they demand that he resign whatever position he held and no longer support this bad regime. So Ruggles does. And then coming through the crowd is this fellow, Benjamin Hallowell. Hallowell was a customs agent. And if you remember much about what happened before 1770, it was the arrival of the customs agents that caused all of the trouble. And Hallowell, customs agent, he'd been up in Salem meeting with the governor, and now he's on his way back to Boston in his carriage that has a coat of arms on the side. And he is not what we would call a modest, unassuming man. He sees a large, angry crowd of these rubes. He thinks what he should do is lecture to them, and they should go to their homes and let better people than they are mind their business. And he steps out of his carriage to do this and realizes that they have surrounded him. He manages to get on a horse and get away from the mob, and then chases him from Cambridge through the area, through Brookline, Roxbury, to the gates of Boston, and he narrowly escapes with his life. And as all of this is happening, our friend Oliver had been meeting in Boston with the governor. He comes back to say the governor is not going to send troops, but it's really too late. Now we surround Oliver's house and force him to resign as lieutenant governor, which he does. So on September 1st, Governor Gage calls for a meeting of the assembly and also thinks it would be prudent to disarm the countryside. The next day, he has the lieutenant governor, 2 members of the council, and 1 of the judges forced to resign by the Cambridge militia simply meeting as a large group of angry citizens. And this is really a shift here, as Abigail Adams noted, that there was a great apprehension of an immediate rupture. And Joseph Warren, who's becoming one of the leaders of the this whole provincial movement, talks about the generous spirit of our ancestors seems to have been revived beyond our most sanguine expectations. And he says that Massachusetts citizens have a right to determine for themselves under which government they will live hereafter. Ezra Stiles, who's at this point a minister in Rhode Island, later becomes president of Yale College, says that New England is ready to fight for their liberties. So this is what's happening in September. And Gage informs Lord Dartmouth, the secretary. These are some of the other houses in Cambridge that are attacked by the angry mobs. Now, one of the other acts that the Parliament passes as a way of reining in Massachusetts is the Administration of Justice Act. And this requires people who are accused of crimes against the crown would not be tried in Massachusetts or wherever the crime happened, but in London. So it's going to prevent the kind of, bad things we saw happening. And so is anyone from Rhode Island? I know at least there's one Rhode Islander here. Are you familiar with the sloop Gaspee, British revenue ship Gaspee? In 1772, the Rhode Islanders actually burned this British revenue cutter. They could never find who was responsible for it. And we don't want that kind of thing to happen again. So the Administration of Justice Act is going to allow us to round up those responsible, bring them to London to stand trial, and they will not get off as easily as they will with a jury here. This is what's behind. Let's close down the courts because the courts have to abide by this new law. So the Administration of Justice Act is going to change the nature of the legal system here. Now, Gage, as the citizens of Middlesex County are gathering on Cambridge Common, is writing a letter to Lord Dartmouth saying, Dartmouth had said, you should have your meetings in Salem. And Gage says it's not safe for the government to meet in Salem. We cannot protect them there because there aren't enough British troops there. And he does convene a meeting of the council, the mandamus counselor, the dozen or so men he had found who would agree to serve. And he wants to know, okay, where could we send the troops to stamp out these disorders? And these members of the council, who are all sympathetic to Gage, tell him, you really can't send them anywhere. This resistance is too widespread that it's not clear where the troops should go or what they will do when they get there. So this is what's going on with Gage. He has the Administration of Justice Act. He has the Massachusetts Government Act. but he doesn't have any real power. The real power is remaining in this assembly, which he has called to meet in Salem on October the 5th. And we'll get to that in a minute. Meanwhile, in September, as the courts begin to meet, each courthouse is surrounded by the local militia who insist that the court be closed. This is the Worcester County Courthouse on September 6th. It's closed down. Peter, and this is the men of Worcester County who had marched to Worcester to put down to stop the courts from meeting. And one of my favorites here is the town of Sutton sends 500 men to Worcester on September 6th of 1774. I was talking about this with the state senator, Ryan Fatman, who happens to be from Sutton. He said, I don't believe there are 500 men in Sutton today. But in 1774, they could send 500 men to Worcester. And this is the courthouse in Barnstable. And here, the presiding over the court in Barnstable was James Otis Sr. And when he has the Barnstable County militia, actually it's from the town of Sandwich, marching past, he tells the leader of the militia, a fellow named Freeman, James Otis Sr. is the father of Mercy Otis Warren, James Otis, the other great patriots of the period. And here he is as the leading judicial official in Barnstable County, as well as he presides at the Barnstable town meeting. And Nathaniel Freeman arrives to shut down the court with 400 men from the Barnstable militia. And Otis tells him, it is my duty to tell you to disperse. And Freeman tells Judge Otis, you have done your duty, Your Honor. We will continue to do ours. And the Barnstable court shuts down. And Peter Oliver had built the Plymouth County Courthouse back in the 1740s. Not only is it forced to shut down, but then the crowd that shut it down goes down to the harbor and tries to dig up Plymouth Rock to put it in front of the courthouse. In doing so, they split it. So they get the top half to sit in front of the courthouse. About a century later, they replace, they bring it back to the harbor and cement it back to the old Plymouth Rock. So they're making a statement here about this is part of what we had been doing back in the 17th century. In Taunton, they devise a new flag. It has the Union Jack in the corner and Liberty and Union in the field. So this is what's happening in Massachusetts in the summer and early fall of 1774, as Massachusetts is calling for the governor had called for a meeting of the assembly. Then sometime in the middle of September, Gage realized calling the assembly would not be such a good idea. So he calls it off. And on the 5th of October, several hundred men who had been elected by the town meetings to be their delegates to the assembly arrive in Salem, and the governor doesn't show up. He had called off the meeting, but they say we hadn't gotten that message. And they wait for the governor. And according to protocol, the governor will come to the assembly and tell them whatever it is he needs to tell them. He never shows up. So they say, you know what? The office of governor must be vacant. We'll continue meeting as a provincial congress, not as the assembly, because the governor isn't around and we'll simply get along without him. So the provincial assembly becomes a provincial congress. They move out of Salem to Concord, and they meet in the Concord Meeting House, and their committees meet in the Wright Tavern. And the real power in Massachusetts is shifting to a provincial congress, but it's the same body that had been elected as a provincial assembly. And Joseph Warren wrote to Josiah Quincy, who was now on his way to London, that you would have thought yourself in an assembly of Spartans or ancient Romans, had you been a witness to the order that inspired those who spoke upon the important business which they were transacting. We don't know what business they were transacting because they all took an oath of secrecy. All we can find out is who was there. But in general, Warren said, you may be assured that they approved themselves the true representatives of a wise and brave people determined at all events to be free. And all of this is happening here. And meanwhile, Quincy, as I said, the reason he is not at the assembly is he is on his way to London. To go to London to meet with members of the British opposition as well as members of the British government to see if we can avert a crisis we know is coming. As Gage had said in January, we don't know where this is going to end up. And now we see the word from Massachusetts is things seem to be going pretty badly. So Quincy goes to London, and there he meets with Benjamin Franklin, who had been in London now for more than a decade, meeting with British officials. There's a whole other story we can tell about Franklin in London. But Quincy thought, based on what he had heard from folks sympathetic to the British side of things here in Massachusetts, that the British public would be as outraged about American behavior as the Parliament was, or as the ministry was. But he is really astonished. The British public meet him, find out he is an American, and they applaud what the Americans are doing in defense of liberty. And if liberty can be crushed in America, it will be crushed here, they tell him. And it's something surprising to Josiah Quincy. It's less surprising. He does meet with various British officials. He meets with Lord North, the Prime Minister. He spends about 2 hours with North. North is a very good politician, and North is able to convince Quincy that he really is sympathetic to what the Americans are doing. At least that's what Quincy thinks. Quincy also says it was a little puzzling because these are two men, Quincy and North, who each like to talk, and how either one was able to let the other say anything is a mystery. But North was, I think, the better politician at this. Then Quincy goes to meet with Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State for American Affairs. Dartmouth has on his desk a copy of Quincy's observations on the Boston Port Bill. He had read this. He knew the arguments. And Quincy believes that Dartmouth and North were more sympathetic to the American cause than he had been led to believe. But then, he thinks, after he met with North and Dartmouth, so did Thomas Hutchinson, who had arrived in London earlier in the summer, and Hutchinson tells Dartmouth, don't listen to anything Josiah Quincy has to say. Quincy also attends the King's opening of Parliament in December, and he's so close to the king, he can almost touch him as the king processes in. And then during the king's speech, which he had written in consultation with Dartmouth and with North, the king warned about dangerous persons who are poisoning the minds of His Majesty's subjects. And John Lawrence, who's from South Carolina, happens to be there. And as the king said this, according to Lawrence, he seemed to be pointing at Josiah Quincy, one of these dangerous persons poisoning the minds of His Majesty's subjects. And Quincy predicts, after hearing the king's speech, there is going to be a civil war. Now, Parliament then debates the answer to the king's speech, and in the course of this, Lord Hillsborough, another former Secretary of State for American Affairs, talks about men walking the streets of London who belong in Newgate or Tyburn, that is British prisons. And when he is asked whom he means, Lord Hillsborough says, well, of course, I mean Franklin and Quincy. So among some in the British government, there seems to be some support for the Americans, certainly among the British public, but not among those who count. And so this is what's going on in London. Now I'll shift back briefly to North America, because the king, having said that there is dangerous people poisoning the minds of his subjects, calls for more taking away of weapons. And an order goes to Newport to seize weapons that are being held on Goat Island off of Newport. It happens that the Rhode Island Assembly is in session in Providence when they hear about this order, and they immediately send a ship down to Fort George in Newport to collect the arms before the British can get them. So Rhode Island is taking the weapons away before the British can get them. and they worked through the night. They cut off 44 cannon to Providence by December 10th. The next day, a British warship arrives from New London, and when the captain asks the governor about the guns, well, the governor says, well, we took them away to prevent their falling into the hands of the king or his servants. He's not saying, oh, I don't know where they went. He says, we took them away to keep you from using them. And and then while the Rose is in Newport, it's obviously not in New London. People in New London take the weapons out of the forts in New London so that the Rose can't get them. And at the same time, north of us in Newport, Rhode Island, the Crown's attempt to get the weapons from Fort William and Mary is foisted when Paul Revere warns the militia there. So this is what's going on here. Further attempts by the Gage and by the British military authorities to disarm the countryside, and successful attempts by the colonists in Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire to prevent them. And this gives us some more context for what happens in April of 1775. But still, neither side wants a war. And Franklin and Quincy have been in London working with the British opposition, which is also hoping that they can have in the elections of 1774, the replacement of the regime of Lord North with one more sympathetic to the American cause, less likely to go to war. So this is what Quincy and Franklin are doing, and they're unsuccessful. One British observer says that trying to do anything with the British opposition is like trying to put out a fire with a wet dishcloth. The British opposition, and my apologies to any of you who may have strong feelings about the British opposition of the 1770s, was not very effective. But Franklin and Quincy are still there, hoping they can do something. And Franklin is at one of his clubs when someone comes to tell him, there's a lady who would like to play chess with you. Now, Franklin was a very good chess player. In fact, he's in the Chess Hall of Fame. And he wrote a pamphlet called The Morals of Chess, which was printed. The first Russian book about chess contains Franklin's Morals of Chess. So he loved playing chess. He also liked ladies. So here you think two real inducements for Franklin to act, but he doesn't. The next week, Franklin is back at the same club. The man says, there's a lady who would like to play chess with you. And he gives Franklin the lady's address. The lady is Catherine Howe. She is the sister of General Howe and Admiral Howe. William Howe, the general, is on his way to Massachusetts to become the new governor of Massachusetts. Lord Howe is going to be the commander-in-chief of the British military forces in North America. But at the end of 1774, the Howe brothers and the Howe sister are trying to avert this crisis they all know is coming. In fact, General Howe had been elected to Parliament as one of those opposition members trying to avert an American war. So Franklin does go to play chess with Catherine Howe as a pretext for her two brothers being able to come and talk to Franklin about what can be done to avert the catastrophe they know is coming for the empire as well as for America. And they fail. So thank you. Yes, sir, in fact. Yes.
I'm coming.
Someone's coming to the mic for you.
Just a moment. That was fast. All right, now we're gonna have a question and answer session. There are two mics. I'll take one half of the room, Bob. Where's Bob? He's gonna take the other. So we just ask you, if you have a question, please wait until we give you a mic and speak into the mic, and you are first.
I just have an observation. I mean, what you describe is really a civil war rather than a revolution. I mean, at the same time this is happening, the British were conquering India, and they didn't have the same kind of consideration.
That's a very good observation. And the British are conquering India. They learned some things from this experience, what they apply in India. But you're right, it is a civil war. On the other hand, calling it a revolution suggests something else. I think it also makes us think about other revolutions that we've known about. Typically, and at least my study of them, the hard part is not throwing out the bad old regime. The hard part is establishing one that won't be worse. So it's revolutionary here is not so much getting rid of the British, but it is establishing a different kind of government that won't have the same oppressive tendencies that the British system did. And the British system, I fear I could go on for another hour about this. It's a terrific question. And so my short answer is yes, absolutely. And for a lot of reasons. So thank you.
Yes, this is something more close to the laws, but every time I look at these pictures and whatnot of these older houses and whatnot, and gigantic houses, what kind of occupations do these people have that allowed them to have those resources?
Primarily, they were merchants. You know, the big houses in Cambridge that we saw were all built essentially by the same family, the Vassal family, who were West Indian planters. And these were their summer homes. And so they had wealth that came from trade, actually from the sugar trade. The plantations they managed in the West Indies. And they built these as summer houses. Others are merchants, like Hutchinson was a merchant, as well as being governor, other things. So, and trade, and we look at them and we think, boy, what grand houses. Anyone who is familiar with the great houses of England would see these as really pittances. I mean, they're really insignificant compared to really their fabulous wealth in England. But yet, primarily, they're merchants. That's where much of the wealth came from, except for the vassals who were West Indian planters.
How did the people get their information? How were they educated and informed about all of this that was going on? The little bit of knowledge I have was the Boston Gazette, which Sam Adams, having just read the book, wrote daily 2 or 3 times a day. I know that's one aspect, but did everybody around Boston read the Gazette?
No, and there are a number of other newspapers too. New England has a higher rate of literacy probably than anywhere else in the British Empire. Everyone will learn to read because they're founded by Puritans who believe everyone should read the Bible. So there is a lot of reading going on. And it's one thing to think, yeah, everyone's reading the Boston Gazette and getting their ideas. One thing we actually see in this is the towns are responding, not because of what they read in the Gazette, but what they see as a threat to the way they have been running their towns for so long. And a lot of it seems to be word of mouth, ways it's hard to figure out how word spreads. And how did those several thousand guys on September 2nd know what had happened the day before? Or how did those 500 men from Sutton know, let's march in? There's communication networks. And again, if we could find those missing links, it would be great. One thing we know about Samuel Adams, he burned most of his papers because he knew what he was doing was organizing this conspiracy, and it would be treason not only for him, but for anyone else who was involved. So we have ways we can't understand. Back in 1772, when the committees of safety have a big meeting, or committees of correspondence have a big meeting at Faneuil Hall, and they send out Boston's report, what they think should happen. And the towns of Massachusetts then in 1773 and 4 are responding to the Boston report. And in many cases, they're going further than Boston would in standing up for their liberties. For example, the town of Newton says that no honest man can be silent in the face of tyranny. And other things like that, that is, they are seeing this. And they're not simply waiting for Samuel Adams to tell them what to do. in the mid-19th century, there's an historian in one of the towns of Massachusetts who finds out there's a guy living in the town who answered the alarm on April 19th. So naturally he wants to find out from this guy. And so he goes to talk to him. And being an historian, the historian, knew what had led to this. So he says, was it the Stamp Act? And the guy says, I don't think the stamps ever were unloaded. And he says, well, was it the Intolerable Act? He says, I'd never heard of them. He says, was it the Tea Act? He says, I didn't drink tea. I said, so what was it then? And this man said, we had always governed ourselves. They were not going to let us do that anymore. We could not let that happen. So the thing that is really setting the towns off, even towns like Concord, is that we no longer can have a town meeting. And that comes from the Massachusetts Government Act. And it's not though the folks in Concord they really didn't like Boston or Samuel Adams. But here is a threat to their liberty. It's similar to what Quincy was saying about punishing the innocent along with the guilty. So it's a very good question. I wish we knew more what was setting them off. I suspect it wasn't because we're reading the Boston Gazette and Samuel Adams is telling us what to think. That's in fact the opposite, because one of the real things we're doing is not following leaders or simply listening to what someone else tells us, but thinking for ourselves.
I can hardly wait for you to come back and to tell us what happened in 1775.
Thank you.
I just want to give you some unpaid advertising. It's so nice to put a face with the voice because I listen to your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Very good. Well,
But
thank you.
Now I know what you look like.
Okay. That's why it's mainly audio.
Okay, hang on a minute. Jack, I think you're next. Put the microphone right up to your lips.
What part did the castles of each town play?
That's a very good question, because the British referred to them as their Black Robe Regiment. And the ministers were essential figures in all this, getting back to how word spread. And again, some were on the Patriot side, some were not. And again, the pastor is chosen by the congregation, which doesn't mean that he simply goes along with whatever the congregation wants. So they have this fundamental idea here about local government, but again, being governed with under the hand of God. William Billings was actually the choir master in a Boston church, and in 1770 he wrote the first verse of what becomes essentially the anthem for the Continental Army. Tony calls Chester. Each of his songs, he arranged them alphabetically, so the title has nothing to do with the words. But the lyrics for this are, let tyrants shake their iron rod and slavery clank her galling chain. We fear them not. We trust in God. New England's God forever reigns. So you have this fundamental idea here about who we are and who is on our side. And the ministers are essential to this. But of course, ministers are trying to keep the peace. And some are more forthright than others. But again, according to the British, the ministers are all this regiment who is preaching these things. There's another story about a member of parliament reporting back on what he found in Boston. He knocked on a door and the servant answered and he said, I've come to see your master. And this young woman says, I have no master but Jesus Christ. And the members of parliament also laughed at this because it's ridiculous. But again, here the congregational idea is you have no master but Jesus Christ. So how are you going to govern these people is one of the things. And that's why the ministers are so important. I should have mentioned more of the ministers. Again, they were savvy enough. Some of them do. There's a good, the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, in which I'm also involved, has just put on our website Ebenezer Parkman's World. And Ebenezer Parkman was a minister in the town of Middleborough, I believe, or Westboro. And we have his diary from 1719 to 1782, where he's talking in this period about what's happening in the town. So they're the ones most involved, more so, well, than perhaps the members of the Board of Selectmen or other political bodies. Very good question. these two gentlemen I saw had their hands up.
If Bravo was such a bad guy, how did he get a street named after him in Cambridge?
Well, basically, he lived there, right? He wasn't a bad guy. That's another thing to remember. They're not such bad guys. He also had been chosen to be colonel of the militia. And that's something you get, you're elected by the men. Of course, it helps if you buy their uniforms and do other things. So, yeah, and Ruggles used to have a street named for him in Roxbury. So, yeah, and Brattle Street, that's where he lived. And I thought Phil had, here's this young lady in the back. Behind, Phil first.
Outstanding presentation. An odd subject, but tarring and feathering. Didn't hear about it, and I'm very curious as to how it helped the mobs to motivate people to do their will. It happened, and here we are, and things can happen to you.
Yeah, we try to make it sound like they were just out there protesting, carrying signs. John Malcolm is one of these guys who gets tarred and feathered twice. Once up in Maine. John Malcolm from Maine, and up there he's a kind of an informer for customs. He gets tarred and feathered, comes to Boston, and people keep pointing him out as the guy who got tarred and feathered. And so he gets tarred and feathered again. Yeah, so you think it's funny. Here's another tarring and feathering. And this happens in Barnstable. A woman named Elizabeth Freeman. She's an elderly widow, and she runs a little shop. Someone puts up a liberty pole in the square near her shop, and she said she's again a woman who speaks her mind. And she says someone should tear that ratty old pole down. And a few nights later, someone does. Well, we don't know who did it, but we know she didn't like the pole, so she gets tarred and feathered, ridden around town on a rail. Now, she's, as an elderly widow, doesn't have a husband. Her son, at this point, happens to be with Washington's army at the siege of Boston. But these guys who are not with Washington's army are tarring and feathering her. Now, the town of Barnstable has recently been putting up statues of its more notable patriots like James Otis, Mercy Otis Warren, who did not live in Barnstable. They really should have put up a statue of her. At the next town meeting, James Otis Sr. tries to apologize for this affront, and the town refuses to accept the apology. They think it's not enough. You just apologize for tarring and feathering an elderly woman who doesn't like the ratty old liberty pole. And so it makes us think about this in a different way. Are they lawless mobs, or are they something else? Again, what we're finding is the guys gathered on Cambridge Common, or those guys who gathered in Worcester, weren't mobs. They were the militia. These are people who already were serving. And so I think the questions you're asking all show us how much more there is to figure out about what was going on here in 1774, 75, and 76.
Okay, Marion, and then we'll have one or two more after that. Okay,
You
go.
mentioned earlier that the common people in England were sympathetic to the American cause. How did they find out about it?
That's a very good question. Newspapers for one thing, pamphlets for another. There's also a transatlantic communication network. One thing you see in the late 1760s and early 1770s is these Americans like Quincy. Quincy is referred to as the American Wilkes. John Wilkes, who was a leading British radical. And he's arrested in 1770, late 1760s, and he publishes a magazine called The North Briton, which is a radical English publication. Issue number 45 does something you're not allowed to do in England, which is to criticize the crown, the king. So that one is suppressed. You find all kinds of references in the American literature to number 45. In fact, if you see the Revere Bowl at the Museum of Fine Arts, it has number 45 on it. And it is made of 45 ounces of silver and is made to hold 45 gills of rum. And when the Sons of Liberty started putting a flag up on their big tree, which they call the Liberty Tree, it has 4 white stripes, 5 red stripes. So there's this connection between the English radicals and these Americans who see a connection with John Wilkes. This is why Junius Booth. Junius was another anti-British radical publication in about 1770, and someone named Booth names his son Junius. Junius becomes an actor. He names his son John Wilkes. Again, this connection between English opposition and these Americans. We sometimes forget that England did have a parliamentary system where people voted, not as many as did here. And in fact, one of the arguments that comes up later on during the war, which doesn't go as well for England as they could imagine, people in England start saying, how come in America they are having a war because they want representation? And in England, there are lots of places that don't have a representative in parliament. In fact, members of parliament are not called representatives, they're called members. And there are places like Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, big parts of London that don't have a member of parliament. But that changes. In fact, one member of the parliament says, your rotten system is going to be brought down by your war in America.
Bruce, do you have a comment or a question? You want? Oh, I thought you wanted to say something. Okay.
This gentleman in the back just put
You
him in.
have the final question. Can you handle that responsibility?
I try. Because to what extent does England's Civil War and Cromwell, is this tied in terms of ideas?
I suppose.
In England and then in the colonies, that what happened in the English Civil War and the collapse of the monarchy or the off of his head? Is there any tie-in?
Well, there's a tie-in in the sense that the British English government develops out of that with a monarch, but it's quite clear the Americans don't want a monarch. And so then how do you choose one? How do you choose someone who will govern? That's one of the big problems. It gets back to what you were saying, what you were asking earlier about the outcome of the revolution. And yeah, there are some places in America where the English Civil War looms much larger than others. New England, they tend to be more in support of Cromwell. Johnson, by the way, here's a fun thing for you to do if you get to the Boston Public Library. They have John Singleton Copley's massive painting of King Charles I going into Parliament to arrest these members of Parliament for treason. And, you know, we know that what happens is Parliament then arrests him for treason and tries him and cuts off his head. You do see other references, like for some reason Copley thought this would be a popular painting in England. It wasn't, which is why it's in Boston. And it was purchased by Josiah Quincy Jr., actually, to be in the Boston Public Library. But yeah, they do refer to history here in New England, more so, and they do in other places too. In Virginia, suddenly you see a great interest in Bacon's Rebellion in the 1670s. So it's a very good question. And is it motivating them? Not as much, I think, here in Massachusetts as is the attempt to impose the Dominion of New England in the late 1680s. And John Wise was a minister in Newbury who, in the 1680s, he was arrested for charging, again, a minister in Newbury who is saying that we're not under the authority of the crown. And in the 1770s, that whole idea is resurrected. I read a really interesting paper of the resurrection of John Wise, who was brought back into this conversation. More so, I think, than the English Civil War, which would probably raise a lot more issues in London than something that, you know, the British public probably has mixed feelings about. A good question, as they all have been.
Would everybody join me in a warm round of applause for God? Wonderful. So good to have you back. We haven't seen him in 3 years, I think. Thank you so much. Wonderful to have you back. And thank you for being such a wonderful audience. I mean, do they not ask Great questions. Are they not engaged? This concludes our presentation. We hope to see you next month for NATO at 75 on November 12th. Thank you, everybody. See you again next month.